Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We have a special treat for you this week, a live recording of a panel titled Free the Market, Ending the Corporate Welfare Racket, that I moderated at CPAC 216, the Conservative Political Action Conference. Listen to our four noted panelists take conservative hypocrites to task. Let's get right to it. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you joining us today. I think we've got a lively panel in store for you. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Bill Frezza, the host of Real Clear Radio Hour, also a fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I want to thank our sponsors, Charles Koch Institute, for putting this together. I'd like to introduce each of us in turn and then get right into the meat of the subject. To my right is Peter Schweizer, who's president of the Government Accountability Institute and author of Clinton Cash, which some of you may have read. Next, we have Alison Fraser, who's Managing Director of Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute and the former Director of the Roe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Next, we have Tim Carney, Senior Political Columnist at the Washington Examiner and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the author of The Big Ripoff. And finally, to my far right, Matt Mitchell is a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center and the author of Pathology of Privilege, The Economic Consequences of Government Favoritism. So corporate welfare is a large and controversial subject, and it easily brings out the hypocrisy of so many political actors. They loudly condemn government handouts to others, and they're first to line up at the trough for their own constituents, and this is a problem in both of our parties. My hope is that our panelists can convince crony corporatists within the conservative movement to stop doing that, to give up their hypocrisy and become supporters of free markets rather than supporters of particular big businesses. It's a tall order, but if the party can do it, it's such an advantage. Give that some thought. Let me start off by tossing the ball to Matt, and I do encourage the other panelists to jump in throughout the session. Matt, there's a sentiment making the rounds that the most dangerous enemies of capitalism today are capitalists. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I would have said maybe 18 months ago, well, there's no real constituency for socialism, and I suppose I'm wrong, given the election. But I do think that there is some truth to that. And the reason I say that is the organized intellectual opposition to free markets, whether it's Keynesianism, whether it's socialism, it's just that. It's an intellectual opposition. It's organized by pointy-headed academics who don't have a lot of force behind them. But the opposition to open and competitive markets from capitalists themselves, those who are in favor of free markets in general but want an exception or a privilege for themselves, want protection from foreign competition, domestic competition, want a subsidy, want a regulatory privilege, whatever it is, those folks not only are highly motivated, but they're extremely well-heeled, they're extremely well-connected, and it's an incredibly strong force. And so this is why free market thinkers from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman to Friedrich Hayek have all said often the greatest enemies of free market capitalism are capitalists.
And Bill, can I give some examples of where that's exactly right? First of all, for a long time, you had environmentalists pushing and saying, why don't we subsidize or make people buy these energy-efficient light bulbs? And there was a New York Times story in 2013 that said no amount of subsidy or anything like that could get people to buy these bulbs. And then what you had was, in 2007, the Republican chairman, or now the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Republican Fred Upton from Michigan, he decided to get on board with the law that effectively outlawed the traditional incandescent light bulb. When he was asked why he did that years later, he said, I wouldn't have done it, but industry said it was okay.
Sure.
That they win. They are the most dangerous ones because they win. Bernie Sanders doesn't win. Obamacare would not have passed if you hadn't had the insurance companies give the opening bid, the drug companies support it, the drug companies promised to run millions of dollars in ads in favor of Harry Reid and other Democrats who were challenged by it. The biggest Republicans' expansion of government, Medicare expansion, the bailouts, all of those things were done at the request of big business. So that's why they're the most dangerous enemy. I don't think they have the worst ideas or they're the most consistently evil. It's because they actually win, while sort of the tree huggers, who a lot of conservatives worry more about, they don't win unless they get General Electric or somebody like that to get their back.
Don't you think that the same thing is really true when it comes to the state and local level, when you have these big economic development packages put together by governors and by local county commissioners and even mayors and so forth, where they compete against each other, really, in my view, to get big and small firms alike to come to their communities and build plants and create jobs. So I think it's endemic across, the federal government with big bailouts, but also down to like the most local level.
That's probably the most visible aspect of crony corporatism is this phalanx of corporations who line up looking for the handout. But not all of them do that actively. Some are actually a little reluctant. Peter, you point out that campaign donations are not always about active influence, but are sometimes a response to extortion. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the model that a lot of people operate under when they look at money in politics is kind of what I call the Jimmy Stewart scenario. You know, Mr. Smith goes to Washington, you've got this well-minded guy who gets in elective office, and all these outside nefarious forces are trying to corrupt him, and if we can just keep Jimmy Stewart, the senator in this particular story, clean, everything will be fine. The assumption there is, I think, that the corruption occurs from outside forces and that the people that are in public service are clean. That certainly happens sometimes. I think a lot of times, though, the opposite happens. And an example that I would use would be the high-tech industry. I've written about this. I know that Tim Carney has as well, that the high-tech industry in the 1990s basically wanted to be left alone. Microsoft had, I think, one lobbyist who was in Bethesda, Maryland. They had very little lobbying presence, as did a lot of Silicon Valley. The problem was the threat came of regulation, first by the Department of Justice under Bill Clinton, then by members of Congress. Lo and behold, flash forward 20 years later, Silicon Valley has the best lobbyists, makes enormous amounts of financial contributions. I don't think they do it necessarily because they want handouts. I think it's basically protection money.
And it's not just regulation. There's nothing like an antitrust investigation to shake money out of people's pockets.
Right. But I think here's the key problem, and I think that the challenge is on a practical level, very few people, if anybody, is going on Capitol Hill, meeting with members of Congress, doing fundraisers, saying, we don't want a special favor. That's the challenge. I mean, where is the political constituency for a member of Congress or Senate who's running for re-election, who needs fundraisers, who needs endorsements, who needs foot shoulders? They're just not getting a lot of people showing up and saying, we're giving you this contribution, we're raising money for you because we want a free market.
Yeah, here's a check, please go away.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
But I think Peter told half the story. The beginning of the story may be they come to town for defense, and that's surely what happened. That Microsoft lobbyist was in the sales office in Bethesda. That's where they put him. Now Microsoft has one of the most beautiful lobbying buildings on K Street. It's this glimmering glass tower. And if you look at what happened, they then employ this team of lobbyists. And a lot of what they lobby for is leave us alone, or maybe don't hack into our phones. And so there's a lot of good things that they lobby for. But once the lobbyists are there, they can't just do that.
Right.
If what you deliver your memo of here's what I accomplished this year, and it's all I kept the government a little off your back, that's not as good as, say, in the stimulus, there was a provision that said if you have a school-age kid and you buy a computer, you get a tax credit. You didn't even have to give the computer to your college-age kid. You could have kept it yourself. You had a lot of the tech community lobbying for the net neutrality regulation. So it creates this problem where the lobbyists, to justify their own existence, that's one reason, and partly because they perceive the advantage they can give to their employers, they might come to town defensively, but then they start seeing how government can benefit them.
Hey, Alison, you've worked inside the beast, in particular at the Office of State Finance in Oklahoma. How do the permanent government bureaucrats, the people who actually dish out the subsidies to businesses, at the behest, obviously, their political bosses, how do they view the game?
Well, I think they view it as part and parcel of their, of their role, really. And, I have to say that I was fighting for free market principles. So I wasn't one of those bureaucrats.
And I have to say, you're not there anymore.
And I'm not there anymore. But, they view it as part and parcel of their role. And one of the super frustrating things for me at the time was this thing that I just referred to earlier, which is this notion that rather than competing for firms based on things like a good education system, well-trained workers, entrepreneurial workers, pro-growth policies like low taxes and a low regulatory burden, and and a lot of capital and things like that, there was this notion of having to compete by doling out kinds of subsidies.
It's a contest.
Right. And so I would say that from my observations, and this was many years ago, that it was endemic across so it was definitely, it comes from the top, from, going around the country trying to get businesses to come to the state. It goes in through the legislative body, and then it filters down into the bureaucrats who are doling out whatever kind of subsidy there is. And there's a whole racket, too, of these economic consultants
Sure.
who tell you, X firm, if you're in this business, here's a package for you, and you can play off, let's say, if you're an aircraft manufacturer, you're located in maybe Seattle. You could move to, say, Chicago, or maybe you think about opening a plant somewhere in the South.
Alison, talking about aircraft manufacturers, let's talk about the Export-Import Bank, which is really the granddaddy of corporate welfare. And apparently it's an eternal program that even Republicans can't kill no matter how hard they try. Tim, what is it about XM that gives it eternal life?
Concentrated benefits, diffuse costs is the way, smart people like Matt Mitchell talk about it. First of all, it's kept basically off budget. It's a loan guarantee program. So like Fannie Mae never cost taxpayers money anything until it did, XM basically doesn't cost taxpayers anything. The cost is in the distortions. And this is true with most of the worst corporate welfare. Ethanol isn't a budget cost. It creates economic distortions. It allocates capital and resources inefficiently. The distortion costs are almost impossible to see, and a lot of the victims don't realize they're victims because maybe it's a firm that didn't come into being because
it's busted out, unseen.
Yeah, it's the unseen cost. Or your competitor's doing better because he's getting a subsidy, but that's not necessarily as quantifiable as the people who receive it. So the Chamber of Commerce flies in all these small businessmen, and they all say, look, this is huge for us, whether they're Boeing suppliers or the direct recipients who get less than half. The small businesses get less than half of what Boeing alone gets from the Export-Import Bank. But then also, more importantly, the lawmakers are convinced that people back home actually care about this. They think that there's a pro-corporate welfare vote because they get the wool pulled over their eyes, when really everybody who would possibly vote on the Export-Import Bank was flown in that day by the Chamber of Commerce. That's why I was pleased, even though I don't have a favorite candidate in this race, that's why I was pleased when Ted Cruz won Iowa. He was the most anti-ethanol candidate, and he not just won, he got the most votes in history. It showed there wasn't a pro-ethanol vote in Iowa. And there isn't a pro-Export-Import Bank vote, but the reason these agencies and these programs stick around for so much is because the people the congressmen talk to are all the people there with their handouts, the people who have the incentive to show up and go begging.
Yeah, but I think that there are some direct victims that story is not really told enough. So if you think, when we talked about Boeing, think about what Boeing is doing to other American companies. So you have Boeing that gets subsidized to sell planes to international air carriers that then go and compete with our U.S. firms on international routes. So, there's a Delta airline problem where, subsidies to Boeing are hurting a U.S. firm. And, it's just crazy. So
Can't that be fixed with more handouts to Delta?
Oh, I don't
And Delta
think
asks
so.
for them.
But that's the slippery slope.
Yeah.
That's definitely the slippery slope. And that's, part of the retaliatory process. So, okay, we have these bad policies. Let's not undo the bad ones. Let's get more bad ones.
Yeah, well, that's what keeps them in business. So,
Right.
yeah. So let's spend a moment on our corrupt and dysfunctional banking sector. It's been the source of so much misery over the past decade. Bailouts play a central role in the crony economy. Let me toss this out to the whole panel. How has the moral hazard behind government-provided depositor insurance been leveraged to create reckless monsters that are too big to fail?
Well, I think it's an enormous problem, and I think that one of the things that when you look back at the history of it, the 2008 bailout was not sort of an anomaly that had never occurred before. You go back to 1993, 1994, Goldman Sachs had taken a big position against Mexican government bonds. Imagine those being a risky investment. And Goldman Sachs was in trouble, and they got help from the Clinton Treasury Department with liquidity and some other policies. So, the 2008 bailout is not the anomaly a lot of times people think it is. I think the challenge is that the financial system, whether it's the FDIC guarantees, whether it's some other issues, you have a situation where you really don't have a free market banking system. And then the question becomes, do you allow banks to continue to get large and it becomes too big to fail, or do you have to consider something which, look, it goes against my free market principles, but you have to start thinking about, well, do we have to start breaking up these large banks, assuming that you're going to have FDIC guarantees and other policies in place where clearly the political class is not going to let these institutions fail? Do you have to consider other reforms? And I think that's kind of the position, where we are today.
You mentioned the magic word liquidity, which is different from insolvency. And this is so complicated to explain to people because these banks that became illiquid because of the counterparty positions they took They claim, well, we paid all the bailout money back. What's the problem, right? And how do you explain to people that having Uncle Sam as a liquidity backstop just causes more problems?
Well, it encourages greater risk, for one thing, and I think that's the problem. I mean, the German central bank, for example, has been very strong in this, as they were in the 2008 crisis, is that you create a moral hazard situation. And if you look at banks like J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs, whether it was the East Asian financial crisis, the Mexican government bonds, in some instances the Russian financial crisis, in those cases, they received benefits indirectly from the government directly that encouraged liquidity. And the problem is it just encourages greater risk. I mean, it's the classic example in finance. Generally, the greater the risk, the greater opportunity for reward. And so if government is encouraging greater risk-taking in the goal of reaching greater reward, when they make a mistake or bet wrong, we have to clean it up, and it just grows exponentially. So that's the problem. The crises get larger because the risk becomes greater, the leverage becomes greater, because in the past they've learned to rely that Washington's going to bail them out.
And I think you can see that sort of in the history of bailouts. A lot of people don't appreciate it was not until 1971, almost 200 years after the founding of the Republic, that the federal government came to the rescue of a single company. I think it's instructive that the company was Lockheed Aircraft, a major contractor. But once that ball started rolling, it really picked up steam. So 1971 was the first bailout of Lockheed Aircraft. By the end of the 70s, we'd bailed out a railroad. And then in 1979, it was Chrysler. 1984, it was Continental Illinois. And that's the first time that we actually heard the rationale of too big to fail or systemically significant. By the end of the 80s, of course, and the early 90s, we had the bailouts of the savings and loans. Then the federal government took an interest. I'll arrange the private bailout of long-term capital. They also bailed out the private creditors of countries like Mexico in the mid-90s. And then, of course, the big one in 2008, in which the federal government bought stake in or bailed out over 500 firms. I mean, completely unprecedented in magnitude. But the thing is, each one of those built momentum and made the next one more likely. And the reason is, long before the federal government hands a dollar or a penny to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are incentivized to make bad decisions based on the expectation that the federal government will lend them many, many dollars. That phenomenon, the promise of a bailout, you don't even have to bail them out yet, but the promise of a bailout lures firms into making bad decisions and makes the bailout a self-fulfilling prophecy, unfortunately.
Alison, let me ask you the $750 billion question, and people always use this against me when I'm arguing to keep the feds out. Would we have been better off in the long run if the feds during the global financial crisis just let the chips fall where they may and force the big banks that had liquidity problems to just work it out with their counterparties without a bailout?
That's definitely the big question. I don't know that we're absolutely ever going to have the answer to it, but I think in the long run, I think there's a high probability that the answer is yes. The problem that the politicians had, of course, is they wanted to minimize that and make that as short term as possible. Politicians don't like anybody to have any harm given to them. So they were under every incentive to save jobs, to prevent huge losses, and things like that. And of course, this all happened in a massively important election year.
The last unmedicated crash was in 1921.
That's right.
And the
You
federal
read Jim
government
Grant's
did
book on that,
absolutely.
yeah.
The federal government did exactly nothing, and
Right.
it healed itself in 18 months.
Well, and there is a middle ground. If I guess I'm going to end up being the squishy moderate on this panel, but there's a middle ground between doing nothing and making sure that you save the banks. In other words, when Bernie Sanders talks about how he wishes these Wall Street people were in jail, I just wish they had lost their jobs because they had failed. In other words, you could have had the government get in if they thought there was going to be a fire sale of these assets and driving everything down, way down out, say we're going to help these things be slowly wound down, but we're not going to guarantee where we will save these specific institutions. Goldman, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, JP Morgan. Maybe JP Morgan would have survived. Bank of America, I don't know. But you had Tim Geithner basically admitted a corporatist view of the economy. I think we need these big banks. I don't think the economy can work without these five big banks.
Right, and we need them to be big.
Yeah, we need them to be big. We need them to be these ones. I call it protectionism. Protectionism isn't just trade. There's a form of the economy now, and we need to make sure that that form is preserved. So that's I think, one middle ground you can take is say the government could have intervened, but it didn't have to make it its goal to save Bank of America.
I think that's right. And I was just going to add to that. And let's not forget, it wasn't just the bailout of the banks and the specific banks involved. It didn't have to be like that. But Congress and the administration, and Geithner in particular, kept reinventing what the bailout was for, including ultimately to put it to AIG, that wasn't a bank at all. And that was the biggest loser, if I'm not mistaken. And then they also bailed out the auto industry. What does that have to do with saving banking, whether or not you pick individual firms that are going to, survive the catastrophe?
Well, and I think here's the challenge. I think you're right, and I think a middle ground sort of makes sense. But think about this for a second. With the bailouts, the stretching it to the auto industry, did anybody pay a political price for doing that? I don't think they did, and I think that's the challenge. What is the constituency? I'm trying to be a little practical here. I get accused all the time for not being practical, but I'm trying to what is the constituency to deal with crony capitalism? The Export-Import Bank fight, which was a great fight, one that was important to have, well worth having, that we should have won. Again, we lost. So those that in the end carried the water for Boeing and the few companies that benefit from export-import, are any of them really going to face a political challenge or a political price for supporting export?
I mean, again, to the flip side of that is the first step has to be you explain to the politicians there isn't a constituency for corporate welfare. So if you're afraid to do the right thing, which is oppose Exim or oppose ethanol because you're afraid you'll be punished at the ballot box, there's no evidence of that in Ted Cruz's Exhibit A. I was hoping that Stephen Fincher, the Republican champion of the Export-Import Bank, was going to be Exhibit A on the other side.
Right.
He ended up resigning. I'm sure he's going to go back to his farm in Tennessee and not take a high-paying job as a lobbyist here in Washington. But the fact is that there's not going to ever be a giant sort of export-import bank vote, despite my own fantasies that would carry an election. But what there is going to be is it's part of a broader narrative of we stand for free enterprise because right now the game in America is rigged, as Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders says, but the rigging is being done by the insiders in Washington, big business and big government in bed together. So I don't think it's a huge winning issue ever on its own, but it's part of the only way to make free enterprise into an issue that's not subject to populist demagoguery from either, a Republican candidate or from the left.
Okay. I warned you this was coming. It's name and shame time. All right, so I really want to get each one of you to call out a particular corporation who's guilty of getting fat on government largesse. Who wants to go first?
Can I say a quick point, and I will go first?
Okay,
then.
go ahead, Matt.
Tim brought up the phrase concentrated benefits diffuse costs, and he's saying that this isn't a winning issue. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I actually think in some ways it may be a winning issue by pointing out the concentrated benefits that benefit from this stuff. People do not charge the bayonets for efficiency. I wish they would as an economist, right? But they do for equity. And our history in the U.S. is one of people rising up and being really ticked off about this stuff. Go back to the Tea Party, not the one of 2010, but the original Tea Party. What were those patriots so ticked off about? Well, they were ticked off about corporate welfare, about the fact that the Fannie Mae of the 18th century, the East India Tea Company, had received a benefit. They and they alone were able to escape the Tea Act, the tax on tea. In many ways that launched a revolution. Not too high a taxation, but privileged taxation. People really get ticked off about that. So my first example of a company I would name and shame is the East India Tea Company.
No, Matt, we're not going to let you get away with that. Pick another one.
I think Tesla is a nice example. In one way, it's a nice example because, boy, those are beautiful cars. I mean, this should be something I'd love to say we can celebrate this company and say this guy's got so much vision and it's such an interesting engineering feat. But it's so sad because they get privileges left and right. The federal taxpayers who buy the cars are privileged. The company itself gets subsidies from the states, and they're really aggressive in getting these. Tesla broke ground in multiple states in order to lure them into offering major subsidies for their manufacturing plant, which ultimately was located in Nevada.
And don't forget the ZEV credits.
Aggressive.
That's pretty creative. These are the zero the emissions credits they're getting from their competitors in California.
For a while, most of the money that they were making was from checks paid to them by Ford and Chrysler.
And let's not forget, they make cars for millionaires.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would give it to the crown to General Electric. In one of my books, the chapter on them, I subtitled it "The For-Profit Arm of the Obama Administration." The CEO, Jeff Immelt, his letter to shareholders in 2009, so the beginning of the Obama era, said, "Government will now be a champion and a regulator at the same time of industry. We are resetting capitalism." And he was totally ready to get on board. And Obama said, we're going to fund stem cell research, and so GE got on board in that. Obama says we're going to fund more high-speed rail, and so they hire up Linda Daschle as their lobbyist to invest more in high-speed rail. Everywhere they look, green energy. There was one point where GE started a joint venture to burn the methane coming off of a trash dump because that reduced the carbon footprint, and then sell the resulting carbon credits to Google, who was buying them just, so they could claim they were carbon neutral. They wanted to make money off of that. The whole game, every sort of aspect of corporate welfare they would get into. And then on Export-Import Bank, they would say, if we don't get these subsidies, we're going to move overseas. And then they would go overseas and say, by the way, France, you better give us more subsidies or we're moving back overseas. And so they would play both sides of it. So I think that they were a corporation that in the Obama administration decided that the new model was corporatism and that they were going to be the pioneers in that.
So we've got GE and Tesla. Allison, who do you want to nominate?
So I have GE and Tesla. I also have SpaceX, and just the poster child for all of this to me is Elon Musk and how ingenious he's been about getting corporate.
So
getting
Elon is a
government
hero in
largesse.
Silicon Valley. He's so complex to attack.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, he's the expert at conning money out of taxpayers. On the other hand, he really has been an innovative character.
Yeah.
I mean, the car is
Absolutely.
incredible.
Absolutely. But why do we need to have taxpayer support for all of these really innovative things like beautiful luxury cars for millionaires that get subsidized?
So how do you explain to Silicon Valley that this is not a good plan? How do you get through to them?
I mean, I think you appeal to what entrepreneurship is about.
Yeah.
Entrepreneurship is the exciting idea of finding new ways to please customers, to create value for people. That's why you went into this business. You didn't go into business presumably to suck it up to a politician.
Well, but this is an uncomfortable idea sometimes for conservatives and libertarians, although I think in the last few years since the bailout, it's said a lot. Business is not just for the sake of profit. This idea, the headline of that Milton Friedman piece was, the responsibility of a corporation is to maximize its profits. If you actually read the piece where he wrote that, you realize it was just another New York Times trolley headline put in by the editors. He doesn't really argue that, and we have to actually refute that. And I call it my awesomeness theory, that entrepreneurs aren't just pursuing profit. That's a necessary condition. But it's not the whole thing. It may not even be a majority of it. And for some of them, it's not even the number one reason. They are pursuing the fact that they're going to change the world and walk down the street and say, everybody on the street is carrying this thing that I invented. That makes me awesome. So you don't even have to say they're trying to make the world a better place. They're just trying to make themselves be awesome. And that is a huge part of what motivates entrepreneurs. And that if it's just motivated...
Especially the Silicon Valley crowd.
And so if it's just motivated by profit, why bother being Elon Musk? Because, there are other guys who make a lot more money running a hedge fund that just trades off their connection to some regulator.
Well, let's take
think
it back
that-
to the Hall of Shame for a minute. I want to give Peter a chance to nominate his top crony corporatist.
These are all great choices. I would probably add to that list a company, and I'll call it by the name that it often goes by, Government Sachs, which would be Goldman Sachs.
Would that be the vampire squid?
And I would say Goldman for a couple reasons. One, they have been masters at getting liquidity from the federal government when they get way over their heads. They try to convince us they're sort of masters of the universe and they know what's going on, but they oftentimes run into this trouble. I think the second thing is they benefit enormously from the revolving door. You look at a lot of people that populate the Treasury Department, other government entities, they oftentimes have a Goldman Sachs pedigree. During the financial crisis, if you read some of the memoirs, it's very clear that Goldman and some other financial institutions had access to inside information well before even members of Congress or others did. So I would say Goldman Sachs.
All right, that would have been my choice too, but good. And I'm sure everybody here can come up with more, but I want to give the panelists a tough one to ponder, and I got to tee this up for a second. I've been on the board of private companies, and I'm ashamed to admit it, but I've had to rent senators to help break regulatory logjams. But I refuse to let our CEO pursue outright corporate welfare. This was during the heyday of earmarks, and it was like, no, not on my watch, you're not going to do it. But the CEO of public companies have a fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value, and they can be criticized or even sued if they don't accept government handouts when they're offered. So how can enemies of corporate welfare demand that CEOs just say no when the law says they have to say yes.
Well, the left does this, right, where they say you have to clean up the river, or I don't know, maybe it's suboptimal profit-wise for GE to cease dumping mercury into the Hudson River. Maybe it would, but they still can stop doing that. And even if it's not illegal, they can say, well, for our image, for the value of our brand, we have to do that. And they value their brand so absurdly well. I mean, that's why when you start going after them on Twitter, they respond, because they value that so absurdly well. So we need to maximize the reputational costs of being a crony capitalist. And I'm the most biased person in the world because I'm a journalist, and so what I'm saying is we need to publicize this stuff more. But it's true, we need to maximize the reputational costs of being a crony capitalist. I've had people write me and say, I'm never buying a GE light bulb again. I'm never buying a Tesla, and I'm never buying a Tesla either, but I don't even get to that point for the boycott thing. I don't think boycotts are necessarily effective, but if there is reputational cost to being a crony, then that can give these people some cover. Another thing is we are moral creatures. We're not just profit-seeking creatures. In our personal lives, we sacrifice money for better things all the time. An executive should be able to say to their investors, by the way, we're going to pursue profit, but within the bounds of our moral standards laid out ahead of time. Here they are.
I think that's right. I think that's really important to think about. Is the business exist to create money or profit, or does it exist to create value? One of the ways that a CEO can pursue their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders is it's one thing to take a subsidy that's on the books. It's another thing to actively go out and lobby for a new subsidy or expanding existing subsidies. For example, also on my name of shame, are the three largest recipients of farm subsidies: Riceland Foods, Producers Rice Mill, and Farmers Rice Co-op. Do you notice a theme here? But, we just had a farm bill in 2014. There were millions of dollars spent lobbying. It was a so-called reform where they repealed direct subsidies program, 90% of which went to 5 crops, and they replaced it with like 5 new programs, uncapped them. Okay, you didn't have to lobby for that.
I would add to that as well. I think these are all great suggestions. I would also add to it to tell the CEO that Jefferson reportedly said it, Reagan certainly said it, which is to the extent that government can do something for you, it can do something to you. Right. So if you are creating a scenario where you are maybe creating a dependence or you're getting a certain set aside, you as the CEO need to be aware that probably the people in Washington, D.C. are going to come calling, asking for something in return.
I believe there's a line from The Godfather that reflects that sentiment.
The student lenders is a perfect example. They just got subsidized starting with LBJ or even Eisenhower, and every president would come in and give more subsidies to kids going to college, and most of it would go through the student lenders, and it just got piled up. And one day, Obama literally said, this is now an unnecessary financial intermediary, and he was kind of right. And so they nationalized a big part of the student loan program. I'm reminded of another thing is, I like beating them up. It's also important if they do good things to applaud and reward them. I had to say that because Fred Smith is in the audience, and he always reminds me to say that.
That's true. No, I think one of the things you got to point out to businesses is often the stuff really does not empirically pay off in the long run. Look at the long protected industries: steel, autos, agriculture, urban taxis. Are these guys super wealthy? No, and there's a reason for it. There's 2 reasons. One is government extracts the rents. What I mean by that is you often have to have a really costly asset in order to get access to your privilege and to maintain the privilege. Sometimes this asset is a piece of farmland that entitles you to agriculture subsidies, and guess what? Farmland is artificially more expensive because it entitles farmers to agriculture subsidies. Sometimes this asset is a little piece of tin that entitles you as a taxi medallion owner to screw over every customer you see for the next several years. Well, guess what? The price of being able to screw them over for the next several years is capitalized into the value of that asset, and they trade for $1 million on eBay. Or sometimes it's a Gucci-clad lobbyist on Capitol Hill, which gives you exclusive access to 535 members on Capitol Hill. It's a limited asset. There are very few of these guys, and so companies have to pay huge exorbitant funds for these lobbyists that entitle them to it. So there's that, but then there's this nice phrase, with government shekels come government shackles. And it almost never comes for free. There's concessions. The insurance companies got an individual mandate, which required all of us to buy their product. But guess what? They also had to have community rating, which says that they have to charge everybody the same price, even somebody who's a lot more costly than somebody who's not so risky. So there's almost always something else that comes with it, and policymakers are constantly willing to try to extract that value from whatever privileges they give to people.
Peter, I think it was you who coined a phrase that really spoke to me. It was called monetizing complexity. Was that yours? And it seems to be such an essential part of the government business model that keeps corporations coming back to solve problems that politicians create. Explain how that works.
Yeah, I don't know if I coined the phrase. I mean, other people have pointed to this as well. But essentially, people look at Washington, D.C., and they wonder, why are these bills and laws so complex? I mean, you look at, for example, the Frank Dodd financial reform bill, which when you add all the rules, I mean, is, 8,000 pages long or something. They did a financial overhaul during the 1930s Great Depression. That bill was like 36 pages long. Part of it is, yes, the world is a little bit more complicated than it was before, but I would argue that the bigger reason is there's big money in complexity. I mean, if I'm a staffer on Capitol Hill and I'm writing a new financial regulatory bill that's going to be passed, I want it to be confusing. I want it to be difficult to understand, because once the bill passes, I can resign from my Capitol Hill job where I feel like I'm overworked and underpaid, and I can open up a consultancy explaining to large financial institutions how to comply with this law that nobody can understand.
Wasn't there a fellow named Gruber who did that in Massachusetts, became quite famous?
But also, I mean, I've tracked the names of these people, and we used to have on the Washington Examiner website, the Great Healthcare Cash Out, where I went and found everybody who was named by a member of Congress on the floor in an article. This staffer was key to crafting Obamacare. And then I just put their name up there and waited until I got the Google News alert that they had joined a lobbying firm for a drug company. And half the time on Dodd-Frank, one of these hires, one of Dodd's chief counsels, I think, the press release announcing her hire said, this is one of the most complex, it even had the page length in it, whatever it was, 2,300
They're not even ashamed.
Right. The most complex pieces of legislation, the intersection of government and business is becoming busier, and this person was right there at shaping it. They explain that. And so I don't know if I can attribute bad motives to the people who wrote Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, but I will say, if you wanted to maximize your post-government value, you would create a piece that increased government but didn't crowd out the private sector. So increased subsidy, regulation, and left the regulatory aspect of it, how the agencies would implement it, as open-ended as possible, and that's what Obamacare and Dodd-Frank were.
I think that's exactly right, and Tim has done a great job in following this over the years, this sort of cashing in on complexity. The analogy that I use with people is, imagine for a second you work on Capitol Hill and you know an ancient language like Sanskrit that nobody else knows, and you could actually write a bill
in Sanskrit
that if people didn't comply with, they could go to jail. Do you think you could make a lot of money? You'd make a ton of money. And that's essentially, with Dodd-Frank, what you have. Some very complex regulatory issues. You've got people like Warren Buffett saying, I can't make any sense of this. I don't think it's just misguided regulators. I really do think that people operate on the basis of incentives, and there's a powerful incentive to make laws and regulations complex, difficult to understand, because big industries will pay you lots of money to avoid being in noncompliance and maybe going to jail.
Let me inject a little politics into the conversation. We are at CPAC after all, and present what might be a really hideous thought to many people. The odds makers tell us that a Trump versus Clinton election is very likely. Donald Trump drags about being a deal maker. His Art of the Deal book is what he's all about. And the Clintons have certainly made themselves spectacularly wealthy since leaving the White House collecting tribute. Tim, why are deal makers the kind of politicians lobbyists love?
Well, because they don't have, there's nothing is ever off the table, and that's always key, that they can buy and sell anything. Anytime you have a hard and fast principle, that's your weakness, and that's what somebody like Donald Trump would look after. I know that he's not willing to give up on this, so I'm going to take everything else from him. So that's the first part of it. I mean, with Trump, I think he's favored corporatism. He's profited from eminent domain for corporate gain and that sort of thing. And Hillary, similar, but it's not just that they endorse these corporatist policies, it's that they are willing to buy and sell anything, but also they don't see there as being fundamental limits on what government is allowed to do. I would have thought the government couldn't do what it did in the end of 2008, that it could form a new company that would then buy 80 or 79.9% of AIG and all that stuff. And so you have to have sort of a unlimited idea of government together with a lack of core principles. And if you're a lobbyist, that's perfect because you can always offer them something in exchange, whether it's what they offered Harry Reid on Obamacare or anything else. We'll give you PAC money. We'll go along. We'll support your regulation here that doesn't affect us as long as you include this regulation here that kills our competitors. That is the perfect thing. That the worst thing for a lobbyist is a Bernie Sanders or, let's say, a Mike Lee. Those guys who stand on their principles, that's the worst thing possible for a lobbyist.
I'd like to wrap up our panel looking at potential solutions to some of the problems that you've outlined. Please tell us that it's not hopeless. How can we get the right and the left to work together to reduce corporate welfare? And let's just go down. Peter, start with you and head down the table.
Well, I think actually the left-right confluence on issues of corporate welfare is actually very encouraging. I mean, I've sat down with Ralph Nader for several hours, and we would disagree on a lot of things. But actually, when you hear him talk about corporate welfare, he makes a lot of sense. I think we have to be realistic. I think the overall problem with corporate welfare is the rise in scope of government. And I think as conservatives, we all recognize that. That's sort of the core issue. The question becomes, how do you deal with the nexus, the intersection of money and corporations pushing these favorable attitudes and the actions of government? One of the proposals that I've put out there, it's done in the state of Florida where I live and 28 other states. It's not a perfect solution, but it's helped a lot, is to try to break the ability of the political class in Washington to use the threat or the benefit of government power as a means for self-enrichment. So in the state of Florida, the law is very clear. You cannot solicit or receive campaign contributions while the legislature is in session, period. So you're regulating politicians. You're not regulating businesses. They do that in 28 other states. If you talk to people that are, businesses in Florida, it's not perfect, but they will tell you it's very, very nice to know when the legislature's in session that somebody can't introduce a bill that's going to damage your industry in a negative way, and you've got to pull out your wallet and make a campaign contribution.
Because you're not allowed.
Yes, and I think if you did this in Washington, D.C., if nothing else, you'd have really short congressional sessions. So,
Alison, how would you attack it?
I think one of the most important things that we can have is a lot more sunshine and a lot more transparency. That doesn't have to be anything that's necessarily regulatory, although I think regulatory is very helpful. So if you take, I don't even know how many there are, but all of these local development, economic kind of growth programs in the states and local governments, and say how much is being spent, say where it goes, and say what the lobbying involved is in it, I think that's very powerful. I think having a lot more Tim Carneys out there working, telling these stories, also very, very powerful. I do want to go back to touch on your point, Peter, which is I think one of the consummate failures here is the failure of big government. And I just am in the midst of reading Jim Ottison's book on the end of socialism, and one of the points that he makes is central planners can't plan all this stuff. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have market signals, right? So they make a bunch of regulations, and then they make the wrong decisions, and they try and fix those, and in fixing those, they create more problems. This is exactly what you're seeing in Obamacare. This is exactly what you're seeing in Dodd-Frank. So complex that even the regulators can't write implementing regulations, and it is the consummate failure of big government.
So, Tim, you could pass one law to fix corporate welfare. What would it be?
Well, first, I disagree that we need a lot more Tim Carneys. I actually think we need licensing requirements and barriers to entry to minimize destructive competition. I think the revolving door is at the heart of the problem because I think that's where the bad incentives are created for the policymakers, whether it's the staffers or the cabinet members or the lawmakers. And I think that, again, regulate the politicians, not the businesses. I think that a post-employment restriction that's a lot tighter on making lobbying contacts. And there have been people who have proposed lifetime bans. If you get sworn into the U.S. Senate, it means you may never make a lobbying contact on behalf of a client to the U.S. Senate again for as long as you live. There's a lot of First Amendment questions about that, but I think it passes muster. A lifetime ban for senators, congressmen, cabinet members on ever lobbying their chamber again.
Matt, weigh in.
So I'd look to institutional changes. If you look throughout history, you can actually find examples in the U.S. when special interests have lost. And these have universally involved institutional changes where some rule of the game was changed a little bit. And the characteristics of these are, two characteristics are really important. One, they allowed policymakers to cast conspicuous votes for the general interest. So think of free trade. Congress gives the president the fast-track trade negotiating authority. This has been a huge institutional change. In 1929, the average tariff on dutiable imports was 59%. Now it's below 5%. Despite what Donald Trump says, the economics on this is very clear. This is an unalloyed, amazing advance in economic freedom, and it has been a very, very good thing for the economy and for the world. How did it happen? Well, congressmen were able to cast conspicuous votes for the general interest, but they were able to hide from their special interests. And this is a weird thing about transparency. Alison mentioned transparency, but it's a weird thing. They were able to say, hey, I'm in favor of free trade, and sorry, tire dealership that was in my district that you got open to competition, I didn't cut the deal, the president did. It gave them some cover. If you look at BRAC commissions, they have the same characteristic. If you look at some of the deregulatory effects in the early 80s, most successful deregulation was the airline deregulation in 1978, and then it was implemented in the 80s. A lot of this happened actually because the committee with jurisdiction didn't do it. It was Kennedy who had no jurisdiction over that committee whatsoever. Ted Kennedy is a real free market hero on this one issue because he really shone a bright spotlight on it, but he didn't have anything at stake. The policymakers that benefited from privileging the big airlines from competition, they were able to hide from it. They took cover.
Interestingly, none of you mentioned term limits, which at least would make sure that half the people in Congress weren't out raising money for the next campaign. Is it because it'll never happen?
I have an alternative to term limits. I think you need staff limits.
Ooh.
I don't know about that. I mean, it sends people back out into the private sector.
Yeah.
And you want to have, if you really want to make sure that you're going to get a high-paying job in the private sector, make sure that you hand out goodies while you're a staff member.
Yeah, and I wouldn't favor what would be required as a follow-up, which is you'd have to force them to go back to their home state, so we'd have internment camps for former members of Congress.
Now we're getting somewhere.
And I don't favor
But
that.
what about term limits on serving on different committees?
Yeah, I mean, institutional change on committee chairman is where I would look first, that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both, the committee chairman's job is to raise money from the affected industry and give it back to the members who are running. And that is totally corrupt. Jeb Hensarling, chairman of Financial Services, who has fought a good fight on Export-Import Bank and pretty good fight on bank deregulation and re-regulation, he was criticized that he shouldn't have that chairmanship because he's not cozy enough with Wall Street. The Republican Party as a party needs to start there and say the chairman's job is no longer going, and Paul Ryan as the Speaker of the House needs to start and say, your job is no longer to ask the industry that you regulate and subsidize for money. You should stop doing that.
Peter documents this very well in his book. I mean, look at the enormous disparity in what a member of the ethics committee is able to raise in terms of funding and what somebody like the agriculture committee or the finance committee.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. I mean, Tim touched on it exactly right. I mean, both political parties have price lists. So if you're going to get on like House Financial Services, the expectation is that you basically have to raise, let's say, $500,000 every election cycle. This is not for your own campaign. This is for fellow Republicans. And I actually talked to a member of Congress from Kansas who was on the Budget Committee. He kind of rebelled against what the Republican leadership wanted. He didn't raise enough money being on the Budget Committee, so he was dropped to what's called a C committee, which is a low committee, which is Veterans Affairs. And they basically called a C committee because you can't raise a lot of money from veterans. There's not a lot of constituents there for crony capitalism in it. So this is a huge problem. You're not going to get the kind of actions by political figures if they are expected to raise money precisely from these committees.
Unfortunately, folks, I think we're running out of time. Can you all please join me in giving a hand to our very able panelists? That wraps up our live recording of a panel titled Free the Market, Ending the Corporate Welfare Racket, that I moderated at CPAC 2016, the Conservative Political Action Conference. This is Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Many thanks to our panelists Peter Schweizer, Alison Fraser, Tim Carney, and Matt Mitchell. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. We'd like to take a moment to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company located in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.net. And thank you for listening. See you next week, same time, same station.